Welcome to this evidence briefing from Lincolnshire Research School. This focuses on language, vocabulary in particular, and reading across the key stages. I'm James Siddle, the Director of Lincolnshire Research School.
And I'm Karen Robinson, the Deputy Director of Lincolnshire Research School.
Okay, so first of all, what do we do? What do we do as a research school? Just kind of a brief overview. As you can see from the slide there, the EEF focus on three main things. Mobilisation of evidence, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the guidance reports. Effective professional development is the one that's illustrated there. Generation of evidence. There's a nice example there of Nelly, Nuffield Early Language Intervention. So, for example, the commissioning of randomized control trials and various other efforts to mobilize and generate evidence and how that practically is used within schools. And then there's the synthesis of evidence, particularly with a focus on the teaching and learning toolkit, the early years toolkit, and the partnership between the EEF and Durham University. So those are the kind of main focuses of the work of the EEF. And primarily, that's focused on breaking that link between family income and educational achievement. And EEF do this from supporting schools, nurseries, and colleges to improve teaching and learning to the better use of evidence. And we kind of know that when we think about education within England, that we know that children who are higher and middle performers actually perform quite well, in terms of comparison with global jurisdictions. But actually, it's our disadvantaged learners and the gap between with disadvantaged learners where we don't perform so well. Good example of that is the gap in early years. So on average, children eligible for free school meals come in at 4.6 months below their non-disadvantaged peers. That gap then doubles between the end of Key Stage 2 and again between the end of Key Stage 4. That doesn't always compare the same group of children. It's much easier to be eligible for free school meals, for example, when you come in at the foundation stage than it is between free eligibility for free school meals in Key Stage 3 and 4. And it tends to be our most persistent disadvantaged children in Key Stage 4. However, the underlying truth there is still that disadvantage gap is exacerbated as they go through their journey through school. Particular focus now on our area for today, which is language, social interactions. From Becky Francis, our chief executive of the EEF, that quote there: disadvantaged pupils are 20% less likely than their peers to reach expected standards in reading, writing, and maths by the end of primary school. And as I've mentioned already, that then it exacerbates through their journey through school. But why use evidence? We kind of mentioned it already, and evidence isn't a silver bullet, but it is kind of a best bet. I remember the old CEO from the EEF kind of said, "But if you're not using evidence, what are you using?" And it's that combination of evidence there, but also professional expertise. How can we contextualize the use of evidence to become evidence use informed practice? So it's definitely the combination of those two things. Whether you're working in a large urban school, small rural primary school, for example, vocabulary instruction is going to look very different in those. The evidence base is there, but how do we take that evidence base and add our professional judgment to make sure that we're using effective evidence-informed practice? Karen, do you want to just explain that slide?
Yes, if you've been shared this outside of the link that we've sent you, if you could just click on this engagement data just so we can see who we're engaging with, and also so we can send you the slides and all the extra resources, that will be great, thank you. And if you have any further questions, then just email us on the email address there.
Thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do in this evidence brief is look right through the spectrum from preparing to literacy all the way up to the evidence that comes out in the guide recommendations in the guidance right through till secondary school. So we're going to draw upon a wide range of evidence with a wide range of phases. We also wanted to highlight the early years evidence store, whether you've used this or not in the past, which is a really great repository of videos, information, and evidence linked to communication and language and various other areas. So you've got Communication language on the left-hand side there within the evidence store, personal, social, and emotional development, early literacy, mathematics, self-regulation, and physical development. And there's a huge range of resources and references within the early years store that you can use. Okay.
And we just put this one on to highlight what we're talking about today, which is that side of the communication and language and the overview of that if we have any early years specialists. So that's, we'll develop on this a little bit more, but that teaching and modelling the vocabulary, how that looks really in those early year settings, how we model the language, that interactive reading and that teaching through that collaborative talk.
Okay, so this slide is just to illustrate the common threads. So you can see right on the left there for preparing to literacy, the first recommendation within that guidance is prioritise the development of communication and language. Then that's a thread that develops all the way through from Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 2 and into Key Stage 3 and 4 to develop language capabilities. And wrapped up within that as well is a focus in all the different guidance reports, particularly on communication language and also vocabulary as well. Nice quote here from a colleague of us at the Research School from Mark. He says the language gap is the attainment gap. So a real priority for us, and we'll all know that this is a real priority within our schools. Mentioned already around the toolkit, etc. And this, highlights within the early years toolkits that the communication and language approaches. So just a sort of brief overview of this, you can see that on the left-hand side there you've got implementation costs, and you can see the pound sign, that actually this isn't necessarily something that this is a high cost. Evidence strength in this, they look like handbags, but they are padlocks. So the evidence strength is quite high around this within the early years, that we know that this is likely to make a difference. And then that's translated from an effect size into, if we do this effectively, what was our potential gains in there. You can see at the bottom there that there's far more information that you can access from this around the key findings, how effective the approach is, behind the average, links to disadvantage, and how you could potentially implement this. So a wealth of information there within the evidence here in the early years store and the early years toolkit that you can access. Karen, would you want to just talk about the key findings from that?
So as we've already said, the communication language approach would have a very high impact increase in children's learning by 7 months, but and we'll come on to that later, it's all about how that is implemented. But looking at the very last one is there are many communication language approaches, and it's really about integrating all of them and thinking about how they're being used. And we're going to talk you through them to make sure that high quality vision with those multiple strategies will make that difference. And we'll talk through that vocabulary, language, talk and social communications, and how that adult is modelling those, leading towards independence.
Thanks, Karen. Also, the main focus on this is generally the evidence and also pedagogical approaches and how we contextualise that evidence. But not to forget that third point there, staff are very likely to benefit from training or professional development. So the evidence that sits behind this, and I'll elaborate this on as we go through, is that communication language and vocabulary are likely to improve if there's a successful training professional development program, far more likely, and the different elements and mechanisms and components linked to that. So it's not just thinking about what we need to do, it's how we need to do it. What's the vehicle, what's the training method, and how we support staff through that journey. Okay, so starting off with thinking about the early years in particular, and we're going to move through the different phases. So the key findings from those are reading aloud. That really doesn't change as we go through, to children discussing books, extending children's spoken vocabulary by introducing them to new words in context and drawing attention to letters and sounds. So there's kind of a reciprocal relationship here, for example, between understanding vocabulary and understanding letters and sounds. And as you teach vocabulary, that it tends to enhance their phonological knowledge as you go through, for example. Also include approaches developing thinking, such as sustained shared thinking or guiding interaction. So starting to think about that relationship between oral language and developing self-regulation and thinking about language as we go through. So useful tool from the EEF as we go through, developed by colleagues with us at the Research School Network, is the Shrek approach. So at the beginning, share attention, be at the child's level, pay attention to what they're doing, respond, expand, and have that conversation as you're going through. So the kind of back and forth, to and fro of interactions around language are really important. And building on through key stage one, about high quality interactions and preparing for literacy. Sorry, preparing for literacy into key stage one. So there's guided interactions, shared sustained thinking, tuning in. So very much building on that kind of early years as we go through, asking questions, making suggestions, reminding, encouraging, for example, that idea of clarifying. Those of you that are aware of kind of reciprocal reading, for example, will know that kind of we're moving into the territory of reciprocal reading where we clarify, we ask questions, and we respond to that. Then moving into key stage one and just building on what we've learned already. So implicit approaches to supporting language. Thinking about the difference between explicit and implicit sometimes. When we talk about implicit, what we're talking about is making most of those opportunities that come up sometimes. So it may be that those interactions have taken place around a story, for example, around a discussion, and it's building on those as we go through, responding to feedback, for example, from the child and giving them feedback and developing what that is. So, for example, pondering or asking open questions. I wonder if, for example, implicit corrections. There's a nice example there. I hid the dinosaur in the box. You hid the dinosaur, and just making sure that those corrections are there and being really precise about our use of vocabulary and language. Example from Key Stage 2 is the peer framework. So you've got there, prompt the child to say something about the book, evaluate their response, expand on their response, repeat the prompt and help them to learn from the expansion. So just a nice way, especially, for example, if you're thinking about working with teaching assistants, for example, to have that mnemonic there to really kind of think about, where do we go next and making the most of those communication and language opportunities. Another example on the right there, the acronym CROWD, completion. Leave a blank at the end of a sentence for children to complete. Ask children about something they've already read. Open-ended tasks around asking children questions that cannot be answered with a short response, such as yes and no, and making sure that they're expanding on their ideas. Giving some sort of structure through the WH, who, what, where, why, and actually making them think and being inquisitive and promoting extended answers. Distancing connects books to children's own life experiences, in terms of actually making them think more and how they relate to a particular text, how they relate to a particular vocabulary, for example.
I think now's a really nice point to pause the areas we've been and think about what you're doing in your own schools and how that's planned and how you're getting those opportunities and to think about what work might need to be done with TAs and things. So always just pause, thinking, reflecting on what needs to be done next.
Thinking about the implementation, just the implementation, for example, of the peer framework, actually, how long would it take to successfully implement? What would it look like if we successfully implemented that in our school? What would we see? What would be the behaviour change that we would see within our classroom settings? And Karen, I didn't know if you wanted to think about putting into practice effective ways of high quality talk in secondary.
This is moving into the secondary school, and it's just building on, as James said, all the way through. So just how does it look? So it moves from actually now providing opportunities for structured talk, but it's still the same idea, making sure that teachers are modelling that effective talk, and it's all those sentence ends and things, and how does that look in each subject, and we'll link that a little bit later to the vocabulary, making sure there's the sequencing alongside the reading and writing. How's that look? As I said, we just mentioned that using sentence starters and prompts, open-ended questions, so we're really trying to get the students to respond and expand on their answers, explain why, setting goals and roles, making sure that the students are ready to think, so they've had that wait time, so to develop their confidence. Often many students don't feel confident to quite respond yet, so they've got that there, they've been practiced, they might have got a talk partner to talk that through with first, and then giving that precise feedback, or maybe modelling an answer to them so they can help develop their confidence and gain. And just again, those whole school routines, where are those opportunities for that high quality talk happening?
So yeah, as Karen suggested, having a real structured dialogic process as you go through, and actually at each stage, teachers being aware, but also the commonalities there in approaches across school. It isn't just one teacher adopting this, but actually we see an homogenous approach. So just to focus a little bit more in terms of vocabulary, in all those guidance reports, vocabulary is a common thread. From on the left-hand side there, from preparing for literacy, a wide range, including shared reading, storytelling, all the way across from Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. So, and there are kind of golden, nuggets in there. For example, extend people's vocabulary by explicitly teaching new words, provided repeated exposure. What does that mean? What does repeated exposure mean, for example, and actually considering how does this happen in terms of pedagogy? When does this happen? What planning needs to be in place to make sure that it's across the curriculum? So, for example, links between different words. I often use the example of the word source. What does a source word mean as a word in geography, for example, the source of the Nile? What does a source mean in terms of history, a primary source, for example? So thinking about where it links across the curriculum, but also thinking about tier two language, and we'll talk about the tiers in a moment, about how you can repeat exposure. If you're teaching words, for example, within a particular text, how can you come back to these over a period of time? And some nice quotes here, one from a colleague of ours, Alex Quigley, about why do this? Why come back to it over a period of time? Why explicitly and implicitly teach vocabulary? And it comes back to this thread, and it's worth coming back to this thread all the way through about the notion of a vocabulary gap. We have to be a little bit wary here about using kind of deficit language sometimes. And there's kind of deficit language within the kind of history of educational research around vocabulary, this notion of a disadvantage gap. And we must be kind of careful of that deficit language. Nevertheless, it remains a thread that if you think about like classic studies from research, the Hart and Risley study, for example, which found, and this is often quoted, this notion of a 30 million word gap between professional families and non-professional families in terms of, just kind of spoken language within the home. So, there is that kind of history there within research, but one of the things about using educational research to inform us is using multiple sources. So I've quoted that Hart and Risley one. There has been lots of research since that suggested that gap isn't quite as big as that, but there is still a significant gap. But we've added to our knowledge over a period of time. So it's not just the fact that there's that gap, it's those interactions that are important. So subsequent research, for example, has highlighted that, yes, there's a gap, but it's also the way that language is used. So if you think, for example, even in an effective early years classroom, when you're talking about language, you have a very much a qualification of language. So, for example, a back and forth, a to and fro, a bouncing around. Almost think of it within the home of being around the dinner table. Somebody says something, somebody qualifies it, somebody expands on it. And it's those interactions that are important in terms of addressing any potential gap. And if we don't, what happens? So, for example, evidence shows that vocabulary size at 25 months accounts for linguistic and cognitive skills at 8 years old. If we don't, within our own pedagogy, address these, then actually there's a real causal link between understanding of vocabulary and eventual outcomes. We also know that there are kind of transition points which are particularly problematic, Key Stage 1 into Key Stage 2, but also Key Stage 2 into Key Stage 3. One of the things that we know about that is just certainly within disciplinary literacy in Key Stage 3 that there's an awful lot of Tier 2 and particularly Tier 3 vocabulary that comes through. And actually that transition is often exacerbated by the difficulties and complexity of language that students meet when they transition between Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. So addressing this as early as possible, because that gap happens as early as possible, but also thinking about, for example, how can we support children at transitional points. I'm a huge fan of theoretical models. So this is, Keynes' reading house that's highlighted within the EEF guidance reports, and the various components of the different elements. If you kind of go through that front door and think about those different things, the different rooms that make up overall reading comprehension and understanding, but we can't look at those things in isolation. Those things kind of interact, those different elements of that. I've talked, for example, already about the idea of a reciprocal relationship between vocabulary and phonological awareness. The more vocabulary you know, more decoding you can necessarily do. The more decoding you do, the more you can access vocabulary. But that exists all the way through. For example, vocabulary into reading fluency. If you know what a word sounds like, if you know the word's meaning, you're more likely to read it in a fluent way. And less cognitive pressure in terms of overall comprehension monitoring, which leads to greater reader comprehension, for example. So, links, although that, we break it down through this model in there, actually that there are very much links and interaction between the different rooms and the different elements between word reading and language comprehension. When we look at multiple models, so we move on to Scarborough's reading rope, it's great to see what's in there. It's great to see what's not in there sometimes, but also again to actually understand that actually in terms of a theoretical model, how important it is. And the nice thing about the reading rope, of course, is the interactions, the links between all those different elements that make up skilled reading. And again, within this model, breadth, precision, links, for example, of our understanding of vocabulary as we go through. And when we think about vocabulary in terms of a continuum. If you think about the notion of what does it mean to know a word, all the way from I've never heard it, all the way to I know multiple meanings, can use it in different contexts, etc. So, where are our students in terms of that continuum? How can we take them on that continuum as well? Where are they? Which kind of refers back to this idea of multiple exposures, for example, links across the curriculum. It's a huge undertaking, but actually we can see it's hugely significant. Okay, that word significant. Why is vocabulary instruction significant? What's the percentage of words known in a text to ensure reading comprehension? I've done this with leaders, with teachers many times. And I think people are more aware now
And they are, yes.
than they have been in the past. I think when I first started working on this many years ago, nearly 10 years ago now, then often we'd get kind of 75-80%, but actually we know that actually 95%. So 95 out of 100 words they need to be able to understand. If they don't, then it means that understanding starts to break down, that the reading process becomes such a cognitively demanding exercise that actually it becomes so complex that meaning starts to break down as we go through. So vocabulary is absolutely critical as we go through. Just quick evidence check, in terms of, okay, how do we address that? How do we ensure that our students have got access to the vocabulary that they need and that teachers have got the pedagogical approaches? We just wanted to flag this up, Beck and McEwen. This is the second edition. Make sure it's the second edition that you get. This is a fabulous book. It's one of the best books that I've read on educational research because it combines those two elements of what does the research suggest into pedagogical approaches. So if you've got a particular issue in terms of vocabulary, I'd very much recommend this book and just going through it. And it focuses on a nice kind of almost chronological approach to what we would teach at the beginning of the week, how that language pedagogy would develop at the course of the week. But also one of the really nice elements to that is about assessment, about how you use assessment. Not just to work out where those children were, but assessment as a tool itself, as a pedagogical cognitive approach, how we use, for example, low stakes quizzes to revisit language over a period of time. So a really impressive piece of work from Beck and McEwen. And this notion of tiers, but again, when I first started working this nearly 10 years ago, most people hadn't heard of this. These days, I think most people have heard of this. Karen, do you want to just talk about the different tiers?
So you'll be very aware of these tiers, I'm sure. But that tier one is those everyday words that most children are familiar with, and particularly, we'll come on to in a minute, our ELL students will need to know just to be able to access daily life. Those second tier two words, which are the ones we mainly focus on in our reading perhaps, are those ones that appear frequently and that we need to understand to be able to access that text a little bit more. And then finally, those tier three words, the less common ones, often more subject specific. And you'll be thinking about that in maybe your geography or your science, and a little bit in the next slide's got more detail on those.
So we're particularly interested in tier two, tier three words. Tier two words are the words that tend to appear more in high quality texts. So if you're in the foundation stage, you're in key stage one, and you're reading those high quality texts in there, to be able to access those, going through and being able to see where that tier two language is. And that's where we're going to focus a lot of instruction around that explicit instruction around that tier two language from high quality text. So, as Karen says, we're not going to really focus on the tier one language unless it's particularly specific to early learners or EAL. Yes, we are going to focus on tier three as well, and we might do that in various ways, but they tend to be domain specific. There's an good example from science there, photosynthesis. So absolutely, we're going to do this. I mentioned the word source. You might want to specifically teach that, for example, in geography, in history, you might want to make links between that to try and build schematic knowledge. So definitely we're going to teach those, but we can't avoid teaching that tier two language, which is going to enable our students to access those high quality texts. So in terms of framework, this is often, so again, our colleague Alex Quigley often refers to the SEEK model in terms of a process, a pedagogical process about how we're going to approach explicit instruction. So select the words first of all. We've already started to talk about this. Where are those words appearing in the text that we use, high quality text that we're using? Are those tier two words? Are those tier two words right for the children? And this is again the evidence into professional expertise here. I've got a group of children who I understand where they are. Which words are those tier two words we're going to prioritize? How do I know what their background knowledge is, for example? So that's part of your role. Then it's to say explain. And the very first thing, and you see this much better done in early years key stage one classrooms, is the oracy around it, making sure they can say a word. I was working with a child recently and they were saying the word hyperbole. And of course, they were saying it wrong. They were struggling with it. And of course, hyperbole, and just making sure that they can say the word. The evidence suggests that even just being able to say the word, they're more likely to use it, both in terms of their oracy, but also in terms of their written communication as well. So saying the word, making them familiar with it, giving them a friendly definition of it and discussing what that definition is, giving multiple meaningful examples, exploring that word. They've got an example. The prince was being deliberately obtuse. Where can we see that in examples? Where can we see it in high quality literature, for example? Where can we find other examples? Using an online dictionary is often very good for this, for example. Asking students, for example, bringing it back to them, exploring that language and bringing it back to those children. Where do you know this word? Where can you give examples? And then qualifying any misconceptions there. And then it's exploring that language through etymology, through morphology. We'll talk more about that in a minute. In different disciplines, using multiple choice questions, for example. Is this an example of clutching, for example, clutching onto a bag, clutching onto a tree, clutching onto a cat to pet it? Which is the non-example? Where's the difference between one and the other? And actually exploring through discussion, through examples and through non-examples, and actually qualifying the meaning of that. So, and that's the difference between using something like a thesaurus, which just gives a very limited space of different commonalities there between relationships between words. Actually exploring a word and going through multiple examples of it actually enables children to actually see when to use it and when not to use it. Talks about exploring related images and ideas, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about body cognition, exploring strategies to remember a word, for example. And then there's the idea of consolidate and assess, test and learn, use the word in the real world, research and record that word, come back to it, often by using an assessment process. Another example, this is from the EEF. This is the EEF's vocabulary in action poster, and that kind of takes you through that process again. We've talked about bespoke definitions, for example, the variation, the immediate interactions with those words, those deep processing for those different examples, those multiple choice questions, for example, active interest through different situations, and then coming back again. And that idea of repetition is to go through that. And again, that to me always links into the idea of retrieval examples for assessment and assessment as learning as opposed to assessment for learning, with assessment as learning as the assessment process actually consolidating that knowledge through low stakes testing. This is the Freire model. Often used in science, but adapted for you can adapt it in various contexts as building up that language as you go through. So, for example, you can have this as an empty model. For example, at the beginning of it, word in the middle. What's our definition? That's how we start the beginning of the week. what's a characteristic of that of a predator, what is an example, but not forgetting those non-examples as well as we go up as we go through. And actually these can be used really nicely. These can be used, for example, in a way where they're partially filled in. They can be used by the students where actually they start to gather their vocabulary as they go through and build that picture. And they can be used, as I say, in a self-regulatory way, where we know how you know a model, a graphic organizer like this that they can actually use, and they can start using those independently. Embodied cognition, I've mentioned already, links to those approaches. So the idea is that we can use our bodies in some way to actually kind of almost act it out. This there are implementation issues with this. We don't want children all over the place. So making sure that these are things you can do in your desk, for example, and just thinking about, okay, if we think about a word like truth, for example, how can we make truth into something? How can we do it here? And thinking about the etymological roots. The etymological word like truth, that initial sound is that it comes from the word tree, because it's the idea is that it's buried in the ground through firm roots. So the idea of having that, again, it promotes high quality discussion. The idea that we could actually, we can all be a tree, etc., with the word truth, etc., and modeling that word, what it looks like with our bodies to model the word truth. And then the students' deep interactions with that word, with the etymological root there, with the morphology of the word and the meaning of the word. It's just another way of deeply processing. If we come back to that poster from before, and how we can we can promote that through the cognitive process of embodied cognition, and it's kind of a growing area of understanding within cognitive science, that there is this link between kind of this idea of making our bodies, acting it out, etc., and processing and developing deep understanding and lasting understanding of vocabulary. Moving on to tier three language there, the idea of using flashcards, for example. You've got an example from year three rocks there. This idea that you might have an image on the front, and that image might be generated through discussion. So there might be a discussion around, where does igneous rock come from? Igneous rock comes from the process linked to volcanoes, etc. So we talk through that process. So and then on the back of that, on the reverse of it, you would have rock formed by magma, and you'd expect them to be able to remember these things and use it as an assessment tool. So, for example, how I would use this if I had my card, the first thing you'd do is have the image on the front, and you'd ask them to partially cover that word at the top so they could see the image, but also the language together. It's important that they don't fully cover that, because actually it's the idea of dual coding here. The idea of using a flashcard is the idea of that you've got images and words working together, not in isolation. So you might start off with that initial sound that, for example, that they can see, combined with the image there, then that's used as a prompt working with a partner. So you'd give the prompt, they would look at the image, they would repeat it, and you go, okay, give me a definition. And they give a definition, and then they would say, give me some examples. And if they didn't know what those examples were, you get immediate feedback from your peer. And of course, that can also lead into self-testing as well. Again, thinking about that idea of self-regulation. Where do we want our students to go with this? All the way through from foundation stage, all the way through to key stage 3 and 4. Well, actually, what we want them to be is to be generating flashcards, for example, testing, peer testing, self-testing, and using assessment, using this as a process through their own learning. Mentioned etymology and morphology already, and how that breaks down. There's a nice example from the EEF there. What we know about morphology, we know quite a bit, but also there's lots we don't know about morphological study. So, for example, we know that in studies that had an approaches to explicit teaching that incorporated morphology within the study, they tended to have higher impact. What we don't know from research is that we don't know what those exact approaches are, and we also don't know what the dosage is. So how much morphological instruction is important. But actually, again, the evidence suggests that perhaps more is probably better in this. That actually it's not, the complexity of this is obvious, but actually the more that we do from this, the deeper understanding there's likely to be. So gaps in the research around morphology, but we do know that it's likely to have a positive impact in terms of pupil outcomes. And various approaches. We kind of talked about some of these already. So exploring the root words, word building activities, for example, matching prefixes, encouraging independent word learning strategies, but doing that through using cognitive devices as well. For example, like using the Freya model, which links into that graphic organizers, regular low stakes assessment quizzes. Consisting signposts into synonyms, for example, bringing in other language and how we can make those links across the curriculum. Combining vocabulary instruction with spelling instruction. I've mentioned that already at the beginning, and understanding that those theoretical models again. The idea of vocabulary development with spelling instruction. There's a definite link between the two, and developing, for example, an explicit teaching sequence is always really useful. I suppose it's taking all this information that we know, all this research that we know, all this pedagogical approach, and actually making it feasible and accessible for our classroom teachers. What does it look like? This was an example from a school that we worked at in a while, how they were going to do it, and actually developing a really nice kind of little graphic organizer for teachers themselves and saying, this is what our aim will be. We're going to revisit primary vocabulary, for example, introduce it, say the word, for example. We're going to make a flashcard through dual coding. We're going to introduce the Freya model, and we're going to build this up over the course of a week sequence, for example. Really nice, like the lightness system, links to, again, that assessment as learning, that process of self-regulation as you go through. This idea that, I mean, I always used to do it where they had a whole series of words, and they had them with a pencil case, and they moved them from 1 to 2 to 3 through a self-testing process. So if we go back to that previous slide, is revisit past vocabulary. It might be that the session starts with the lightness system, that you've got partners working together and they're testing each other on their own cards. So you give your partner your cards, they would start testing you, and they would say, okay, let's have a look at this particular word, whatever that word might be, for example. They test you on it, and you say, yep, I can give a definition of this word. I can give you an example of this word. Right, we're going to move that from pot 1 to pot 2. Then it might be that you came back to it the next day, they test you again. Right, I'm going to give you the definition of the word. I can tell you what the word is. I can give you multiple examples. Right, you're in pot 3 with that. You have a good understanding of that word. You've moved on in terms of that process. Other words that you couldn't remember, for example, the exact definition, or you might not remember some examples, might stay in pot 1 and pot 2. And by doing this, each individual develops their pathway on that continuum to understanding of what a word means that I mentioned right at the beginning. So you instead of focusing on all the words that you're teaching in a week, some of them in pot 3, I know these words, this is my particular groups that I need to focus on as I go through. So it's very much that adaptive learning through individual peer teacher interactions and discussion. Karen, do you want to just pick this one up?
This is just, again, building on everything we've been talking about, and this is how it's looking in the Key Stage 3 and 4 guidance report. And it's just going back to the evidence, really, about how important it is to have the access to vocabulary so that children can be able also to access all subjects. And without that, they will have those low outcomes.
So this is an idea of moving into the idea of disciplinary literacy, etc., and also supporting our teachers as we go through. How much actually, how much support have they had to teach vocabulary in science, in mathematics, for example? What does it look like, for example, in those different domains?
And this just builds on it, really. And we've already used the example of source. How can we link those words? Is there time in your school to talk about your curriculum, your vocabulary, and plan those words out so we understand the word source in history, the word source in geography? And so that's really a pause point now to think where you are on that. And are you explicitly teaching those words so children can access your subject and understand it? Because you may be talking about something that without that definition at the beginning, they don't have, and that will also lead to misconceptions as well. So thinking and reviewing your lesson planning.
So that might happen initially at a departmental level. The idea of what's our key vocabulary, what are non-negotiables, what do our students need to know? then moving cross departments into, where are our links? Where, what does it look like between geography and history, for example? It's a big process as you go through, but actually being able to get our students to develop that schematic knowledge, make those links across the curriculum is crucial in their deep understanding of the vocabulary.
And just also thinking about retrieval, where are those times for retrieval? Because
Yeah.
I'll be that forgetting as well.
Okay, so the example of non-examples, and I'm a big fan of non-examples, and we can sometimes gloss over this. The idea, and again, I suppose it's the devil in the details here. When does it work? When does it not work? So giving students a list of words to memorize with no discussion. So here we go. Here's our key vocabulary. Just go away, learn it, etc. Words and definition in isolation, contextualizing it. For example, within high quality text, for example, choosing too many words. Well, where's the sweet spot? Where's that Goldilocks spot of, how many words should we be giving instruction on? So, for example, not more than about 10 or 15 words a week, for example, in Key Stage 3 and 4, far less when you're working with foundation stage. You might be talking about 3 words in the course of a week. Looking up definitions in the dictionary, yeah, absolutely, another skill. Dictionary work isn't necessarily vocabulary work, but actually backing that up sometimes and being able to use a dictionary is important in itself. Rely on context alone for meaning? No, not, shouldn't just do that. And one-off discussions of words. We've seen that deep processing comes from, we develop that knowledge across that continuum of what a word means through constant revisiting of words, that repetition from that vocabulary poster. So 3 conditions for effectively processing: multiple exposures, repeated practice, adding detail to our understanding, the nuance, the understanding of the word, meeting it in various contexts and elaborating on those words, new association. And there's that word at the end there, forging the schema, making them have the deep knowledge across the curriculum. And finally, it's supporting teachers as well. As I mentioned already, in studies, in the research literature, it's very clear that programs around vocabulary instruction were far more likely to be successful if they had a really robust approach to implementation and to support class teachers and other professionals to implement this in the first place. So effective implementation plan is absolutely essential. So, for example, we know that implicit instruction, along with explicit instruction, we mentioned implicit at the beginning of this. Implicit is just picking up on those situations, clarifying words within a context. Explicit instruction is talking about, I'm going to define this word and we're going to talk about this word over a period of time. But a combination of those 2 things is most likely to be effective. So how do we support our teachers in those 2 particular elements of instruction? How do we support them through professional development program, instructional coaching, for example, professional learning communities? And we're making sure that they've got access to the right resources as they go through, and that we're making sure they understand the evidence that sits behind this, that they're able to deliver and sustain that as they move through. Karen, did you want to just talk about the mechanisms of combining that idea of the implementation guidance report with the EEFs, effective professional development guidance report?
So when you decide what the work you're going to do, one of the important implementation activities is that professional development, and thinking about how you're going to do that, what's your starting point, and mapping that out. Now, for that to work, you need to be thinking about combining all of these 14, or certainly one of each. So thinking about how you're going to build that knowledge, making sure you haven't got cognitive overload, and making sure, as you would be with your teaching, you're revisiting prior knowledge. One of the other strands is to motivate teachers. So think about how you're going to set those goals, making sure you're presenting evidence, what you're going to start with from an evidence base like we've talked about today, and really providing affirmation and reinforcement after progress. Then you've got that key, which is developing these teaching techniques and making sure that you're modelling, you're making time for deliberate practice, you're monitoring feedback, you're rehearsing, you're instructing the teachers how to do that. And then after that, and we mustn't forget how you're going to embed that practice, how you're going to encourage the monitoring, how you're going to provide prompts and clues, and think about that repetition that we've talked about. So to make sure you've got a balance of design, you need to get as many of them, not all, it won't be possible, of these mechanisms from each of those 4 categories. So to finish off, we have given you a lot of information there, maybe a little bit too much content over those. So make sure as you look at this, you're pausing, but just thinking now about your context. What was your new learning? Do you have any key reflections and what are your next steps? What part of this do you think you would like to explore further and find more about? Just to remind you of our next evidence briefings if you haven't signed up for them. So our next one will be looking at a writing focus, moving from primary to secondary like we have, and then we'll follow through with maths, sending the mainstream, and hopefully with the new teacher assistance guidance report, and finally working with parents and improving behaviour in schools.
We're very excited about doing the writing one, aren't we?
We're very excited, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was an awful lot of information in a fairly short space of time. Please do get in contact with us if you want any further information. We would love to hear you. We're more than happy to discuss. Vocabulary instruction is a particularly passion of ours, and we hope you found that useful.
Thank you.